Welcome to Everyday Martial Artist, a weekly podcast where you'll join me, Brian Doucette, as I interview a different martial artist each episode and hear their story. Some guests you may have heard of, and some you probably haven't. Be sure to subscribe where all your favorite podcasts are available. Also visit our website at everydaymartialartist.com. If you're listening for a specific interview, I sure hope you'll stay and check out the other episodes. A very special thank you to Topher Williams for our custom theme music. And now, the newest episode of Everyday Martial Artist. Everyday Martial Artist is brought to you by KOOnline.com for all your martial arts needs. Sparring and safety gear, rank belts, uniforms, weapons, patches, and more. Wholesale supplies made by martial artists for martial artists. Visit us today at ko-online.com. Hello and welcome to the newest episode of Everyday Martial Artist. I'm your host, Brian Doucette. As we do every week, we have a brand new guest talking about their background in martial arts and how it kind of affects their everyday life and anything else we can think to talk about and everything in between. Our guest this week, I'm very excited about. This person is a very successful business person. Actually, in 2013, was on the Forbes list for 40 women to watch over 40. So that's really cool. That's quite an accomplishment. She was also the first American to win gold at the World Judo Championships in 1984. So please welcome to the show this week's guest, AnnMaria De Mars. I hope I pronounced that correct.
Yes, that was very good.
Perfect. Welcome to the show, and thanks for agreeing to do this. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Cool. So let's just kind of, like I do with all my guests, go back to the beginning. What I know, if I remember correctly, I read that you started around age 12, but what first piqued your interest in martial arts? What made you, was it your decision? Was it your parents' decision? What made you take that first leap into the world of martial arts?
You know, I always tell people I should come up with a good lie for this because the truth is not that impressive. I was a girl before Title IX. So Title IX was the federal law that passed that said any program that gets federal funds has to give men and women equal opportunities in sports.
Right.
Well, before that, most sports just didn't allow girls to play. And so there weren't very many options. And I was a short, fat little girl. And my mother's, and I'm also super duper nearsighted. I have mega strength contacts. So my mom said, you can't spend your whole life sitting in your bedroom and eating and reading books. And she took me in the car down to the YMCA and pushed me out of the car and said, go join something, and drove off.
Wow.
And back then, in the little town in southern Illinois we lived in, there were basically three choices for girls to do sports. There was, maybe there's gymnastics, but that cost a lot of money. We had no money, so that was out. There was swimming, which if you're a short, fat little girl, you don't want to put on a swimsuit. You know, no one wants to be the fat girl in a swimsuit. And there was track, which if you're a short, fat little girl, you don't run very fast. And I walked into the Y and I saw a girl that I recognized from my 7th grade class, I must have been in, that did in the judo class. So I signed up for judo, and I've got 3 brothers, so I could fight. And it just took off from there.
So what was it about it, those first few classes, that made you want to stick with it? What did you enjoy about it?
That's a really good question. I don't think anybody's asked me that. I think the main reason that I did it was just because there were other kids to hang out with. And it may sound funny now, but at the time we lived in a little town 300 miles south of Chicago, in southern Illinois. Could be pretty south, you know. Mm-hmm. And the Catholic kids, I went to Catholic school. The Catholic kids and the non-Catholic kids did not hang out together. It was, you know, if you were Catholic, you went to this school. If you weren't, you went to the public school. And I think it was just the idea of being around other kids that weren't the same kids I saw all the time. And everybody was very nice. I think that was just enforced by the instructor that we had. And it's funny because years later, I ended up teaching sports psychology at what is now the University of Jamestown. And one of the things that research in sports psychology has found is that the 2 main reasons that kids join a sport are they make friends in it and it's fun. It's not they want to win the Olympics, they want to get in better shape or any of that. And I think that was it for me. It was fun. The instructor was, he had learned judo when he was in Japan in the Air Force, I think. And then he was back going to college on the GI Bill to be a PE teacher. So he was fairly competent as far as running a class for kids.
Okay.
So it was fun, and there were other kids.
So do you remember then that you mentioned that not a lot for girls to do? How much of that judo class was girls? Do you remember how many other girls? You mentioned you saw one that you recognized. Were there quite a few other? Or were you...
No. Well, there was maybe half a dozen. It was certainly the minority. There were, in particular, I remember 2 other girls. They were both there before me, and they stuck around for a while. probably up to orange or green belt, and then they left and I continued on. One of the instructors was the head instructor's sister, and she was black belt. And that's why he had originally allowed girls to join judo. Oh. And it's bizarro, to my girls my daughters to hear about this, that, what do you mean allowed girls, right? That was an option. Are you going to let girls in or not? Because his sister wanted to do it. He thought, well, she should have other girls to train with. So he allowed girls to join the class. And by the time I came along, she was a black belt. There were other girls there. So it was probably a much more welcoming environment than the average martial arts school back in the early 70s.
So then thinking back to that time, in the 70s, I know I've talked to other people who trained back then. What do you think it was different for the girls as far as training went? I know I've just told this story to someone else, even a school I visited in the 90s. It wasn't judo, it was a different martial arts. But I remember this in like 1995 in Southern California. I was visiting a martial arts school, and anytime the instructor gave the class instructions on what to do, he then cut the number in half for the girls and said, you do half as much. But did you ever witness anything like that, or?
That never happened to me. Here's a really funny thing. I have never had a Japanese instructor, even though I trained in Japan for a year. I mean, I've been at clubs where there were Japanese instructors, but as far as my main coach, and it wasn't deliberate, but, I started in the Midwest where there's not a very heavy Asian American population, even less so then. So like I said, my coach was somebody who had, picked up his black belt when he was in Japan for a few years in the Air Force. And then I was in Minnesota for a while, trained with the club there. Then I was in Japan for a year, and Margot Sathe, who was at the time the highest ranking non-Asian woman in the world, was at the Kodokan and ran a class for women who were interested in competition. So there were a couple of girls that were Japanese there, Hiromi Fukuda and Michiko Sasahara, and me, and a couple of other Americans, I think, and a woman from Okinawa. So there's just a handful of us. So Margot ran that class. And when I moved to Southern California, I was at Los Angeles Tenri Dojo, which is a very traditional Japanese club. But at the time, the instructor that Tenri Japan had sent over had left. And so basically, the athletes coached ourselves. Like some high-ranking people. Steve Sack had been on the Olympic team. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Martin, who became my main coach, had been on the world team, I think, 7 times. So I was never in one of those traditional clubs.
Okay. So that actually kind of something you mentioned there about, when you were training in Japan kind of brings up my next question. You mentioned, specifically for people interested in competition. What was it that drew you to competition? I know a lot of people who train in judo and don't compete or don't choose to compete. And I'm sure was that something that the club you were at really pushed, or was it just something you decided you wanted to give a shot and try to compete?
I think it was more me, because people went to competition from our club, but it was not a big thing. For one thing, it was a small club in a small town, and the adults, the seniors, they all had full-time jobs. So this was something they did, 3 times a week, twice a week in evenings. And because I was in at first in high school, then college, of course, I had more free time to travel and do things than someone who has a full-time job working in an office.
Right.
It's funny. That's another thing I don't think anybody's asked me. So you're batting 1,000, because I've done a zillion interviews and people don't often ask these things. The first time I ever heard there was national championships, I decided I was going to win it.
Oh, nice.
And when I heard there was US Open, I decided I was going to win that too. And I did win the junior nationals, the senior nationals, the collegiate nationals, the US Open. They did not add girls to the high school nationals till after I graduated from high school or finished high school. I left high school at 16 and went to college. So I just decided I was going to win. And here's a funny thing. I have often believed that your disadvantages can be advantages. So for me, my mom didn't have money to send me to Europe to train. I got to go to Japan because I got a scholarship in college to study abroad. But she didn't have money to send me to these tournaments when I was younger. The only way I got to the senior nationals was I won the Illinois State Championships, and the Chicago Judo Black Belt Association paid my way, or I wouldn't have been able to go.
Wow.
The only way I got to travel in Europe was Frank Fullerton and Bruce Toops, who were 2 guys in USA Judo at the time who were very patriotic. They bought my plane tickets, or I never would have been able to afford to go. So the advantage to me in growing up without any money is when I was young, I was beating everybody in the local area. It's probably the toughest orange belt around, right? But I thought I was the next great thing because nobody beat me. And if I had parents with more money, they might have sent me to Europe, they might have sent me to training camps, but that was not an option. So then as I got better, I was able to catch a ride with somebody or hitchhike. I hitchhiked to a lot of tournaments, which is crazy to think of when I was like 15, 16, hitchhiked to the state championships and win. And because I couldn't afford to go to tournaments unless somebody else was paying, generally people aren't paying unless you have a good shot of winning. So I didn't go to the nationals. The first time I went to the nationals, I placed third. The second time I went, I placed fourth, which was a rude awakening for me. And so that taught me I better train a little bit more. And then I came back and I went first every other time I competed. The first time I went to the US Open, I got second and I was 17. And then the second time I went, I was 19, I won. So because I didn't have a lot of money, I was usually winning everything in the local area before I could go to the regional area. And then I was winning everything in the region before I could go to the nationals. And I think that was an advantage to me. I think too many kids, at least in the US, are pushed too fast. And then they end up not having the confidence because they've been beat down when they were young.
That's actually really inspiring. So you something you mentioned made me kind of chuckle a little. Now, as a mother yourself of daughters, could you imagine letting your daughters hitchhike to competitions when they were the same age you were?
Oh, hell no. I mean, there are so many things that I did that my daughters didn't find out until they were older, fortunately, that there's just absolutely no way. I mean, Rhonda will tell you, I think the first sleepover she had was with Pauline Macias, who is now a UFC fighter, and they were probably 13, 14 years old. And that's before I would let her sleep away from home.
That's funny. So to back up just a little, think back, what do you remember about your very first competition? I'm kind of curious about that very first one. I'm assuming you were probably an orange belt the first time you competed? I
think I was a yellow belt. I was 12. And the reason I could go is, I think they did it once a year in the little town I lived in. They would have a judo tournament. I think this was probably the last time they did it. So it was in the town where I lived. I was 12 years old. I could walk there. So I walked up to the same place I always did judo. They had the tournament in the gym. I went in, I fought, I got first place. I walked home.
So now how were your parents? I mean, did your parents support this? Did they come and cheer you on?
No. My parents thought judo was the biggest waste of time ever. I won the junior nationals when I was 16. Hitchhiked down there, of course. And I was in college. So I hitchhiked down to the junior nationals, got first place, called home, told my parents, and they yelled at me because why wasn't I at college? So it was in the summer, but I was taking some summer school classes. And so I was very upset. And I called my big brother, who also was in college. And he said, hold on a minute. And this is back in the day when you had, you had a pay phone in the dorm because cell phones hadn't been invented. And there's a long pause, like a very long pause. And he comes back and he lived in a high-rise dorm. And he said, I just went and knocked on every door and told everybody my little sister won the national championships. So my brother was awesome. No, my parents thought sports were a big waste of time. It was never going to bring you any money. And why are you doing it?
So how long did it take them to come around, or did they ever?
My father never did. Okay. My mother, in fact, I called him up one year. So I won the junior nationals when I was 16. I called and I won it again, I think when I was 19. Might have won another time in between. It's been a long time since I was a junior. So I called my dad up when I was 19 and I said, Dad, the senior nationals are in April. I think I'm going to win. You might want to come. And he says to me, AnnMaria, I have no interest in judo. Why would I drive 300 miles to watch a tournament? And I said, if you can't think of a reason, I can't either. And hung up on him.
Wow.
My mother, on the other hand, drove me to the tournament. And she said years later that she really loved it when we would go to tournaments, but she just didn't have a lot of money. And I think it's maybe hard for people who grew up in more privileged environments to understand that even having the money to pay for gas to drive to a tournament was often outside of our budget. So it was very seldom she could go. And usually I would just hop in the car with some other parent that was driving. But she said she loved it when she could go.
That's good. Now, you mentioned you did the year in Japan. And first, when I read this, I thought I was reading it wrong because you mentioned you graduated high school early and started college early. And when you were 18 years old and in Japan, you were a junior in college at the age of 18, which is just completely crazy to me. But just talk about that year in Japan. How was the training in Japan compared to the training in U.S.? Was it comparable? Were things done differently?
Oh no, it was much tougher. So it was great. And here's the thing. I knew nothing, right? I'm 18 years old. I go to Japan because I want to do judo. So a lot of people that study abroad, they pick a country because they're interested in the literature, politics, or economics. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to do judo. And I went to the dean of the School of Business. And this is before Japan had become a big powerhouse in business, right? So Made in Japan was sort of a shorthand for it was cheaply done. So this is way back. So I go to the dean of the School of Business and I say, I would like to apply for one of these scholarships to study abroad. And he says to me, usually those are done by people in liberal arts. No one from the School of Business has ever done this. But then he says, to his undying credit, that doesn't mean you can't. And he signed the paperwork and off I went.
Nice.
So I got a scholarship. So I was able to go. And I didn't know anything about Japan other than judo was there. So like I said, I'd never had a Japanese American instructor. I'd never had a Japanese instructor, unlike a lot of martial arts people. So I show up, I'm going to Waseda University, which is a very good academic school. They have a judo team. And I go in and I see all these judo people. It's all guys, right? And I asked the judo instructor, the judo coach, can I work out with you guys? Now, this is kind of like, unknown to me, some young woman from Japan dropping into USC and asking the football coach, can she train the football team? And so the assistant coach says, absolutely not. Like yells at me, absolutely, there's no way you can train this. Well, now Japan is very hierarchical. And so the head coach sees this and he's very offended because it's his place to say and not his assistant's, right? Mm-hmm. So he comes out and he says, yes, you can. So then I'm on the mat. And I didn't speak Japanese that well and had a year of it or two in college. So very clueless, but they, the guys, none of them had probably ever worked out with a woman before, but they did judo and they did not treat me any differently. I got slammed around a lot. Nice. But then there were a couple, I do remember, and I'm trying to remember, that one of the guys was in his 5th year. So he was, or I think it was in grad school. So he'd been 4 years on the team and now he was in dental school or something. So he was a really good judo player, but he couldn't compete in the tournaments, because he'd used up his 4 years of eligibility. He was a grad student. So he helped me a lot. There were a couple of people who really went out of their way to teach me. And it was just really tough practices. So I did judo at Waseda University, at my university. And then I went to the Kodokan, which is a place where judo was founded. Yep. And they had a separate women's division. And that's where I met Margot. And so there were a lot of other women to train with there, which was really interesting because I think the only other, I probably had a handful of women, brown and black belts to compete against before I moved there. So that was great. And then Margot was amazing. I mean, she's an example of, she died a few years ago, cancer. It's very sad. But she was an example of people who, kind of missed their time because, Lord, she could have won the Olympics. She was the best woman I have ever seen on the mat.
Wow. So did you compete at all when you were in Japan?
No, they wouldn't let me. They only had one tournament a year for women. And then you had to be at least a 2nd degree brown belt for it. And then, so I was all excited. Well, I didn't know that. I had one tournament a year. So I was all excited I was going to enter this tournament. And then I came up and they said, no, you can't because you have to be at least a 2nd degree brown belt and you're not. And I said, what do I need to do to be a 2nd degree brown belt? Well, you have to do these katas. And so there were a couple of my friends, the other 2 Japanese women who were in the competition class. They're like, oh, we'll teach you. But then the head instructor, they really did not approve of me, some of these older instructors. Some did, but some didn't. And the head instructor was like, no, you can't because you would have had taken the test so many months ago. And so, no, they didn't let me compete at all.
Oh, man, that's too bad.
Right. And I think that's why when I came back, I didn't place in the nationals. And I think that's the only time I ever competed in senior nationals. I didn't place because I hadn't fought a competition in a year. But that's all right. I got them back.
Okay. Then obviously you came back and finished college and like I mentioned in the intro, you went on to become very successful in business. Obviously you started having successes in business and everything else. What made you want to keep competing in judo?
I think I wasn't done. I wanted to win the nationals. I won the nationals. I wanted to win an international tournament. I won the US Open. And then there wasn't anything else to win. There were other international tournaments, but it's sort of like once you've done something to prove that you can do it again, not so much, right?
Right.
So I quit competing. I went to graduate school, got my MBA at the University of Minnesota. Then I was on vacation. I get a call from my friend, Rebecca Scott, who my daughter Julia is named Julia Rebecca after her. So Becky and I we were training partners for years. We've been friends since we were teenagers. And she called me up and she said, get back on the mat. They've put women in the World Championships. There's going to be an Olympic festival. They're flying the top women in. And since you have points from the years you were competing, you're in, get back on the mat. So I'm back, started training again, started winning tournaments again. And then the World Championships, the first ones were in 1980, and I was in grad school, so I didn't go. So I figured, okay, well, I'll go to the next one. And then in 82, I got pregnant with Maria. So I didn't go then either. And I had to, when she was 8 weeks old, I think I had to win US Open to pick back up my number one spot. And I did, which is insane when I think now about winning the US Open 8 weeks after giving birth. But
wow.
Yeah, I did. And then that was it. I never lost to an American again. I did a clean sweep of all the US tournaments and won the Pan Am Games and the Austrian Open and the Pacific Rims and the Worlds. And then I came back and went to grad school.
So the Worlds you won, where was that one held? Where is that competition held?
In Vienna, Austria.
Oh, nice. I'm assuming you competing, you've got to travel all over the world. What are some of the cool spots you just, as far as not the competition itself, but afterwards, some of your favorite places you got to visit because of judo? I know because of your business, you traveled many other places, but because of judo, what are some of your favorite places you got to travel to?
I think Hong Kong was pretty amazing. Now, I'd like to see it now after the changeover with Beijing, but at the time, there were so many people actually lived on boats in the harbor, and you would be on a boat and a grocery boat would row up to you selling groceries, and a restaurant boat would row up to you. And there are people, that was it. They lived their whole lives on these boats. So that was pretty amazing. And just being able to go around the city. Wherever I went, I tried to make some time, since I always had to run to cut weight, to be like running around the parks or the lakes, or just to see what it was like and to spend time walking around, not the tourist areas, but just walking around the neighborhoods and going to local restaurants and stores. But yeah, Hong Kong is a pretty interesting place. And Caracas, Venezuela was another one.
And then after you stopped competing, now did you coach quite a bit also?
No, not really very much until Rhonda started competing. So I taught judo at it was Jamestown College then. Now it's the University of Jamestown, where I was a professor. So I taught judo there just as a college class. I would drop into my friends' clubs and coach every now and then. But after I quit competing, I started on my PhD right away. I had Jennifer 2 years later. I had Rhonda the year after that. So by the time the 88 Olympics came around, I had 3 children, 5 and under.
Wow.
Or I guess, yeah. So I was pretty busy. So I'd drop in every now and then, but it wasn't until Rhonda, when she was 11, started judo, that I started coaching her and coaching at the local clubs a lot. And then I started in 2009, Rhonda was teaching at a club here in South Los Angeles, where her sister had been a teacher, a student teacher in history. And Rhonda had started this after-school judo program, and then her UFC career took off. And I was substitute teaching for her, which had to be here and there. And next thing you know, I was teaching there for about the last 9 years.
So did all of your daughters at least try judo, or was it only Rhonda?
They all tried it. Okay. Maria did it for a very short period of time. Then she picked up track. And yeah, it's funny because, her dad was the British national judo champion. I was the world champion. Everybody thought this kid's got judo in her genes. And she did it for a very short period of time and said, I want to run track. Ran track all the way through college, pole vaulted. So wow. Jennifer did it for less than a year. She could have been really good. Jennifer told me, when she was probably 9, I hate all sports and you will never make me like them. And I put her in judo and swimming and volleyball and basketball and soccer. And she was right. I never made her like anything. She still doesn't like sports.
Wow.
And then there was Rhonda, who was in swimming at first, and then she was in judo, did really well in that. And then there was Julia, who looks like, if you shrunk Rhonda down to 3/4 size, that's Julia. And she was really good in judo, won the California State Championships, won the Junior Nationals, was in it from the time she was 4 until she was 11. And then she said, I want to play soccer. And she played soccer all the way through college.
Okay.
She just graduated from college.
Nice. Curious when the idea for the book came about. I was looking, and I believe, is it just the one book that you co-wrote with James?
Winning on the Ground.
Yep.
I think Jimmy Pedro and I were just talking about how when we were younger, we didn't have a lot of help, especially we both were started coaching. Because I did coach a little bit when I was up in Minnesota, going to U of M,
Mhm.
coached at the local community center. But there's just a lot of things that we had to learn on our own that there wasn't, I didn't think, a very helpful coaching program. There was some basic stuff on sort of running a class and youth development, but I mean, I had a PhD in educational psychology. I knew that stuff. But there was just a lot of the technical side, things on mat work that we had figured out on our own. And when I was a kid, my brother did judo too for a while, and we would be like throwing ourselves on an old mattress in the garage and looking up in Hal Sharp's book, The Sport of Judo, different throws. But there wasn't something that talked about mat work at the level that we knew it. So we wrote the book that we wish we'd had when we were young competitors and young coaches.
Okay. And how has it been accepted?
Well, that's a funny thing. When it first came out, it was doing really well. And I kind of quit promoting it just because I've been busy, and Black Belt got bought by or sold the contract to somebody else. So they quit sending me royalty checks. And to be honest, I've just been too busy to follow up with them.
Oh, wow.
So it was doing really well. And they quit sending me checks. So I quit promoting it. And then I got busy. I mean, it was never a ton of money anyway.
Right.
So it did okay at the beginning. And I think if I had time to go and really promote it, it'd do better. So if you work for Black Belt or whoever bought them, Century Martial Arts, I think, bought them. So I wrote to Black Belt and said, hey, how come you quit sending me checks? And they said, oh, now it's these Century Martial Arts people who are in charge of this. Write them. And at the time I was, opening up another company in Santiago, Chile, and it was not high on my priority list.
Okay. Any plans for a second book?
Not at the moment. I'm trying to figure out what my next act is going to be.
Okay.
Our company, 7 Generation Games, is doing quite well. We make video games that teach math and social studies and language arts. And as you might gather, this is a good time to be developing software kids can use in the classroom or at home.
Yeah, I was reading actually about the website. That's a really interesting company.
Yeah, so that's been like stepping up my life. We got a new project on that called Growing Math, which was funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help out a lot of schools in rural areas that all of a sudden, like you're a third grade teacher, and on Thursday they say, hey, you're teaching online starting Monday. So we're funded to work with teachers to hand them lesson plans that they can use to teach math, and a lot of them incorporate Indigenous history. So that's a 2-year project. And we have another couple of projects that are under development. And then after that, I'm trying to think, what I'm going to do next. My daughter, Maria, is the CEO of the company. I'm the president, and Maria has been stepping up to take on more and more responsibility. We are hiring more and more developers. So it's becoming feasible for me to cut my workload back from 12 hours, 7 days a week to 10 hours, 6 days a week. And now I'm working eventually into working a lot less.
Okay.
And what I'm going to do after that, I don't know.
What about the Julia Group? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the Julia Group is basically the research arm of what I do. So I'm president of the Julia Group and president of 7 Generation Games. 7 Generation Games makes games, markets them, trains teachers. The Julia Group is customized software and research. So, for example, the games that are done by 7 Generation Games, we would develop them and do research to see if kids playing the games actually improve their math scores. Or what are the things that you can tweak and change about a game that, especially education, that increases perseverance, that increases the probability that a kid will keep playing it and keep learning. We also do customized software. Say you got a grant for $3 million to reduce unemployment in the city of Minneapolis. Then the federal government doesn't come back to you at the end of 5 years and say, Brian, how'd you do? Because you would say, I did great. Now give me $5 million. You have to pay somebody from the outside to come in and do a research design. Here's the data we're going to collect. Here's how we're going to see how many people that you actually had in classes and how many people actually got jobs and how much money they made. And so I would be the person that did that research design, that maybe do the website for data collection, do the analysis comparing, the improvement among the people in your program versus the city of Minneapolis as a whole. So yeah, basically anything that relates to numbers, software, and research, the jewelry group will do if you pay us enough money.
Okay. So as a lifelong martial artist, do you think there's stuff you've learned in judo that have really helped you in the business world?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are things that apply to everybody and probably things that apply being a woman, because being a woman in tech is still a big minority. I can't tell you the number of times, both in judo and in tech, that I have been the only woman in the room. And because all of my years of judo growing up, being the only woman on the mat at the Waseda University Judo Club, being the only woman on the mat at the Alton YMCA Judo Club after the other women had quit, being the only woman on the mat at so many things, when I was in a board meeting, it just never bothered me. And there are people who are crazy. There are people where there's sexual harassment, I presume, whatever field you're in. There's some of that in judo as well. I will just say it flat out because I've said in affidavits. There was a referee, Fletcher Thornton, look it up, New York Times. He had drugged and molested a lot of underage athletes. And when I was a teenager, he came up and put his hand on me and I said, "You touch me again, I will break your fucking arm."
Wow.
I might have been little, but I didn't take a lot of crap. And so when I would go into board meetings, meet with investors, and some investor doesn't think this is a good investment, which it may not be in their sphere. People who invest in, say, medical technology aren't necessarily going to invest in ed tech, or they might think that my idea is not going to take off. I never took it personally. I was used to being in tough situations. I was used to being the only woman in the room. I was used to having to fight for things. So I think that part of it, for me, being a woman in tech, was very, very helpful. Partly maybe it's that I started my first company somewhat younger. Somewhat older. So I wasn't like in my 20s, but I didn't have a lot of difficulty with some of the harassment I hear from other people. And I think part of it, I wrote a blog on that being a woman in tech, being a psycho bitch is helpful. Because if you met me for more than 4 minutes, you would know I'm not the person to try something on. And even at my old age, a lot of it has to do, are you willing to drop down and fight? And so, not that I got into a lot of physical altercations or any in tech, but I didn't run into some of the problems that I've heard from other women. So that was a good thing.
Great.
I think I felt more at ease in being in a team of all men. I've been in situations where somebody said, suggested going to a strip club or some kind of place like that. And I'd say, I don't think that's appropriate. So I, have felt very comfortable speaking up. And I don't blame men for everything, right? Because I get tired of some of these women like, well, he said this and I felt uncomfortable. Did you say anything? You're 35 years old. Use your big girl words. So I think sometimes there are women who think that because they felt bad about something that everybody should have ESP and know that. So I'm not saying that there aren't jerks in tech, because there are, but also if something bothers you, be a woman, stand up. So I think there was that part of it certainly helped me from judo. I think the part from judo that would help anybody, man or woman, is running a tech startup. I can't speak for other types of startups, but running a tech startup is marathon. It's not a sprint. You read about all these people, and they were an overnight success, but then you also read they were a serial entrepreneur. Well, what that means is they probably start up one company that made some money, but was super successful. And they started another company that failed, and they started this company, and finally they ended up, being successful. That's not an overnight success. Like in my case, we didn't change the company or fold or anything, but we started up the jewelry group doing customized software. Before that, I had started Spirit Light Consulting with two friends of mine, Eric Longi and April St. Pierre from the Spirit Light Nation. So we did that for years. Then I split off the jewelry group. That was in 2001, I think, was Spirit Light Consulting. 2004, 2004 was Spirit Light Consulting. 2008 was the jewelry group. And then we spun off. Dennis and Maria and I started doing Spirit Light or 7th Generation Games kind of as a side hustle in 2012, did it kind of in our spare time, incorporated, went all in 2015. and now we're up to 2021.
Okay.
So from my very first company until now, when we're doing quite well, with 17 years. From when I walked on the mat in judo when I was 12 to when I won the World Championships was 14 years. So I think what it helps anybody with is you realize if you were successful in martial arts, you don't go on the mat and do 50 uchikomis and tomorrow you're going to win in tournaments.
Okay. So another question for you as a parent, and I'm sure you've probably been asked this tons of times, but a friend or a colleague or someone approaches you and just asks for advice. Either they themselves are thinking about getting involved in martial arts, or maybe they want to get their kids involved. What type of tips or advice would you give them on like maybe what to look for in a school, what to look for in an instructor?
Well, the very best advice I got was from Jim Pedro Sr. And this is when Rhonda was a white belt. And his son, Jimmy Jr., I think had got a bronze medal in the Olympics. He hadn't won the world yet. And I ran into Jim when I was at the high school nationals coaching, and I was surprised he even recognized me. And I said, my little kid started judo, and I think she's going to be kind of good. And I hear your son's doing well. Do you have any advice? And he said, always ask yourself, are you doing this for you or doing it for your kid? And if you can honestly say you're doing it for your kid, even if you are wrong, people make mistakes, you'll have a clear conscience. And there are times when I've asked myself, am I doing this for me or am I doing this for my kid? So, and a lot of people say that, but there have been times when Rhonda has left clubs because I didn't think it was the best for her and people were angry with me about it. Or I let her make decisions about things. And if I thought it was the best for her, I agreed with it and I let her go ahead, and other people were angry with me about it. Often people say that their child is their biggest priority, but when it comes right down to facing down other people, well, how come they're not training at my club? Well, because you don't have enough people her size that are competitive to push her.
Okay.
Or, because she needs to work on grips and that's not your strength.
Nice. So kind of a few fun ones maybe to wrap it up. I'm kind of curious, is there a martial artist that you've looked up to throughout your career, one or two that really stand out?
Well, Margot Sathe was definitely one.
Okay.
And she, first of all, I have worked out with a lot of people around the world. Mm-hmm. And most of them on the mat I could beat. I mean, now I'm old, but when I was young, my mat work was pretty good. That's what I wanted with them. And even the people I couldn't beat, I could give them a run for their money. I don't care how big they were. No, Margot kicked my ass every day. I mean, and that's not an experience I had with anybody else, where she could turn me every way but loose. I mean, there are people who they might have had one move I couldn't beat, and usually if they did, they were way bigger than me. She wasn't that much bigger than me. She might have had, 20, 30 pounds on me. But yeah, she was really good. And the other thing was as a person, because I was 18 years old, I knew everything, right? I was smarter than God. I was an 18-year-old college junior. So I decided that at the end of the year, I'm going to drop out of college and stay in Japan and train. And this might have looked good for Margot, right? I mean, I could have gone to tournaments. I would have won. She would have looked good as a coach. And she said to me, no, you're not. And if you do, I'm not going to train you. And I know the reason you're staying here is to train with me.
Wow.
She said, if you look at my credentials, what have I got? The only degree I have is 5th degree black belt. The only job I can get is teaching English in Japan. She said, you have an opportunity. You're at a really prestigious university. You've got one more year of college. You go back there, you graduate. And then if you want to come back here, I will train you. Well, I went, I graduated, I got into grad school. I, went on and did other things. I never saw Margot again.
Oh, wow.
But she put my well-being ahead of her prestige and reputation. And that's the kind of coach I would like to be.
That's great. So this is a question I ask all my guests, might be a little different with you because of your connection, but I'm just curious your thoughts on MMA and how that's come into the martial arts world and changed martial arts. Obviously you have a different outlook with your daughter having competed in it, but just kind of curious your thoughts overall on mixed martial arts and its connection with martial arts in general.
MMA, as a general rule, is a business. And I have nothing against people running a business and making money, but you need to understand that it is a business. So many people confuse business and sports and love. I'm trying to, and I don't mean this in any pejorative way whatsoever. If you're working with a promoter, if you're working with a coach, They are in it to make money. They are not your friend. They are not your family. Now, if you're in it to make money too, that's fine. Just understand what the priorities are. I mean, I think Rhonda was very brilliant. She made a lot of money. She got the hell out. She invested well. She is set for life. And if random people on the internet don't like her, I disagree with a lot of things about Conor McGregor, but he did make one comment I agreed with. I'll wipe away my tears with my money. So it's a business. Yep. There's nothing wrong with business. Just understand when you're in business and when you're not.
So do you have a favorite martial arts book?
Martial art, besides Winning on the Ground?
Exactly. Besides your own. I always got to exclude the ones you've written. But other than that, do you have a favorite martial arts book?
I like Sport of Judo. Hal Sharp wrote it in the 1950s. It's Kobayashi and Sharp. It was the first judo book I ever read, and I still have it. Oh. When my dad passed away and my mom was moving out of her house in Illinois to Florida, because everybody's grandmother needs to live in Florida, she said I could take anything I wanted, and that was what I wanted. So,
okay.
Sport of Judo by Kobayashi and Sharp.
Cool. And then final kind of two-part question. Do you have a favorite martial arts TV show and or favorite martial arts movie? Maybe a guilty pleasure or something.
Boy, my kids will tell you, I never watch TV. I work. That's what I do.
I kind of got that feeling when we first chatted that you probably don't have much time for TV. But.
No, I watch anything the Diaz brothers are on because they're very fine young men. Mm-hmm. Some people are very, very different from their public persona.
Yep.
And they've always been kind to my daughter. Their mom's been kind to my daughter. So anybody who is a good person when there's no cameras around. So yeah, if they're fighting or something, I watch it.
Okay.
Cheer for them. That's about it.
And no movies either?
Yeah, I don't really watch movies. The only thing I've watched lately is the Mandalorian thing, and somebody in there did an armbar. I think it might have been Gina Carano, and I called Rhonda up and I said, that girl stole my armbar and it's your fault.
Yeah, there's actually two very well-known martial artists in that series. That's kind of cool. They're getting some exposure on it because Diana Lee Inosanto is in that show too. So very cool. Well, final comment. That was the last question. But after having this conversation with you, which I appreciate so much, I think I have an idea for your next book. I think you need to write your autobiography because I would buy that in a heartbeat. You have had such an amazing and inspiring life, and I'd love to read the whole story.
People always said I tell them I'm waiting for the statute of limitations to run out.
That's great. That's great. Well, I just want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, AnnMaria, for taking the time to do this and chatting with and getting to know you. I've truly enjoyed it, and I will be sure to put links for your book and for your companies and everything you're involved with in the show notes when the episode comes out. And if you have any last parting thoughts you want to leave us with, but I truly appreciate your time.
I'm always looking for beta testers for our game. So if you work with kids, I would love to hear from you. We'll send them, all they need is a phone or a computer or a tablet, and we'll send them links and they can test out our games, be the first kid on their block and try it out. And we really are interested in getting feedback from kids.
Oh, cool.
So by kids, I mean from 8 and up. So we get games from 8 through high school. So
I usually have two relatives who are teachers, so maybe I'll send them your way. They're elementary school teachers. So
I would love to hear from them. What state are they in?
Minnesota.
We just got funded from USDA to provide services they were one of the 6 states, Minnesota. So I would love to hear from them.
Perfect. I will definitely put them in touch with you. But once again, seriously, thank you for your time. I truly appreciate it.
All righty. Well, you have a great day. I'm going back to work.
Thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist. We hope you will join us every week for a brand new episode with a different martial artist telling their story. If you enjoy the show, be sure to leave us a review. Also, be sure to check out our website at everydaymartialartist.com. There you can find all of our episodes and contact us to suggest guests and ask questions. Again, thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist, and we'll see you next week.